right, well, look, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. This presentation will probably take about 25 minutes, I think. It's pretty fast moving, so there's about 30 slides in the 25 minutes. So I think this will be a rather interesting presentation. So first, maybe just a little bit of background on the Institute for Economics and Peace, those who don't know it. As the Serge said, our work's used extensively by many of the international organisations. We also do a lot of contract research from these include organisations like the OECD, World Bank, United Nations, Commonwealth Secretariat. Our work now is included in thousands of university courses around the world. And we're sort of the downline load of our reports, just from our website, we get over 500,000 of the reports downline loaded each year. We looked at other websites and really build up into the millions. Media reach is large. We had 21 billion media impressions last year, plus 1.1 billion social media impressions. The work's now, we've got people using it in over 150 countries and with references in 3,000 different books. Anyway, that's enough for the commercials. Other than we've got offices in Sydney, where we're headquartered, New York, Brussels, where Serge is based, The Hague, Mexico City and Harare. That gives us the ability to work in the policy centres of the world, but also from Mexico and Harare to draw on practical experience from countries which are highly stressed and with high levels of violence. So what is the GTI? It's now in its 8th year. We cover 163 countries and independent territories, and that accounts for about 99.7% of the world's population. Small countries we don't cover, like let's say the Pacific Islands, there's not a lot there. If we look at this Global Terrorism Index, it's really one indicator inside the Global Peace Index to give you an idea of just the depth which lies within the Global Peace Index. It's developed by the Institute for Economics and Peace, and we use data which we get from the University of Maryland, along with other data sets which we get for further analysis. But the base data of the individual terrorist acts comes out of the University of Maryland. And in this database, there's 170,000 individual events going back 20 years. So now let's move into the results. So this is a quick mud map of the world. If you're looking at green, that's very, very good. If you're looking at red, that's very, very bad. So you can see South Asia, Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa are the 3 areas most affected. South Asia has the highest levels of terrorism, followed by Sub-Saharan Africa, and Middle East now is 3rd, whereas if we went back 5 years ago, it was the worst affected. If you see the green on the screen, they're countries which have suffered no terrorist incidences in the last 5 years. You'll note there's not a lot. So if we looked at that, there's literally only 30 countries in the world which haven't had a terrorist incident in the last 5 years. Now, if we look at the countries which are most impacted, you'll see them all mentioned here and with their rankings. So Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Syria are the countries which are most affected. But the levels of terror in their ranks haven't changed, but the levels of terrorism in all of those 4 countries have dropped substantially over the last 12 months. So in fact, we're looking at the drop, there's been a 15% improvement in the number of deaths from terrorism in the last year. And so that's the 5th consecutive year now that we've had a decrease in the number of terrorists. So it's now down by 59% from its peak, and the peak occurred in 2014. What I would say about each of these 10 countries, they're all engaged in a conflict of some sort, and there's conflicts within those countries. So if we're looking at the deaths from terrorism globally, 96% actually happen in a country which is engaged or in a conflict zone. That stopping war is the best way of stopping terrorism. If we look at the deaths and the spread this year, we'll find that 41% of the deaths occurred in Afghanistan, 9% in Nigeria, 4% in Burkina Faso, and then it keeps on going down there, with 20% occurring in the rest of the world once we get past the 10 countries most affected by terrorism. Now, if we're looking at the improvements this year, we can see them here. Again, the 4 countries which have been the most impacted by terrorism have decreased. Well, in fact, the 5 countries most impacted by terrorism have all had improvements. So Afghanistan, Nigeria, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. So now if we go over to the countries which have actually increased the most, we'll find Burkina Faso has had the biggest deterioration. So we went back to 2018, they had 86 deaths, and that's now jumped to 507. Sri Lanka, the deaths there are just by one attack within the year, but it hit 5 different locations. And so as we look through here, we'll find 7 of the 10 countries actually lie in sub-Saharan Africa. So the biggest increases have been within sub-Saharan Africa, but I'll have a little bit more on that further on. If we're starting to look at the economic impact of terrorism, we can get an idea of how it's made up. And so we're very conservative in the way we account for this. And so it's very, very simple way or very conservative way we account for this. And it's about $26 billion in 2019. There are many other things we don't take into account, like the size of security forces. We don't take into account to counteract terrorism. We don't take into account business losses, nor do we insurance costs or the impact it has on the people's movements and the way that would affect economies. We can see Afghanistan has the largest percentage of GDP affected, but that's half of what it was, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago, where it was Afghanistan 16%, which is the largest. Note Syria's next at 3.4%. That would have been up at about 30% 4 years ago at the height of the Syrian war. And so again, you can see all these countries, other than Sri Lanka, do have conflict going on within their borders. So let's come and have a look at the trends of terrorism over the last period of time. So this is a excellent graph, because it gives you an idea of just the way it's scaled off over time. So we can see the peak in 2014, and then the fall over the last 5 years. If you note the grey area at the bottom, that's the rest of the world, other than the countries most impacted. And we can see how that's sort of slowly rising over time. So we can see that what that tells us that although it's coming off in the peak countries, terrorism is spreading into more countries and coming slightly stronger. Note the slither of the black line right at the very, very top of the graph. So that's the deaths from terrorism in Europe and North America. So although it captures the headlines in the West, and rightly so, because terrorism does affect the whole of society, we can see compared to many other parts of the world, it's a much lower level. In fact, if we look at it over the last 5 years, it would have been less than 0.5% of all terrorist deaths happened in the West. This gives you an idea of the rate and changes in the deadliest terrorist groups in the world. So as we can see now, the Taliban has overtaken ISIL and Boko Haram to become the most deadly terrorist group in the world, and it's ramped up along with the war in Afghanistan. But we do note there's been quite a substantial drop in the last year, probably about 1,800 deaths less, and there's about 5,000 deaths by the Taliban in Afghanistan this year. The lower rate may be related to the peace negotiations which are going on there, but we can't be sure of that. So this gives you an idea of just the number of people which are killed in wars, minor conflicts, and then no conflicts. So note when you're looking at the scales on the left-hand side, so we're looking at, it's about 8,000 people have been killed in wars. If we look at the minor armed conflicts, we find that drops to about 4,800. And then we can see when we look at non-conflict zones, we're now down into the hundreds. So it gives you an idea of just the impact of conflict again on terrorism. If we look at the various regions of the world, this gives you a better idea of the regions of the world and where the conflicts are actually. And so you can see again, so the Middle East, we went back to 2017, most affected. Now you're finding that South Asia is most affected, followed by Sub-Saharan Africa, and then the Middle East and North Africa. So the shape of terrorism is also shifting. So if we're looking at the landscape of terrorism, what we can find is we went back to the decade of the 2000s. We can see there that during that decade, there was roughly 75,000 people killed. But we get to the 2000s and we can see this massive increase. So it rests up to 180,000. We can see that the Middle East is most affected, followed by South Asia, and then Sub-Saharan Africa. And so these increases are truly diabolical. They're really large, but as you can see, the trend of the last good news is it's 59% lower than the number of people killed through terrorism now, let's say, compared to 2014. Now, this gives a good idea of the change in ISIL over those territories. So the dark red bar, and that's the ISIL itself. So we can see it's falling away. But what we can see over the period of time, there's actually been a slight increase, if we look at it, in ISIL affiliates in provinces since 2016. And this is what we can see as the shifting landscape within ISIL. So 27 countries actually suffered a death through terrorism by ISIL, one of its affiliates, or one of the provinces associated with it. And so now if we look at the number of countries recording an attack, as I said, there were 27 in 2019. But if you look, it's pretty constant, ranging from 25 to 35 over the last 5 years. So although ISIL itself, the back of it's broken in many ways, it's actually shifting its emphasis to other parts of the world. And so now if we look at the distribution, it really becomes really clear as we look through here. The dark blue is the Middle East and North Africa. And can we see how you've got the changing trend, particularly to Sub-Saharan Africa, of where the deaths from terrorism are occurring. And now if we come back and we look at this, and we look at the countries, 7 of the 10 countries which are which had the largest increases reside in Sub-Saharan Africa. Most of the deaths in each of these countries are caused by affiliates or chapters of ISIS. And what's, I guess, we found, which was quite fascinating, we did an ecological threat register recently. So what we found is that there's 17 countries in the world in the next 30 years are likely to double their population. And we can see from this graph, from this graph here, there are actually 7, but 6 of them are put here where we can see what the projected increases in populations are going to be between now and 2050. These countries are also suffer from very low resilience. They've got resource shortages, particularly in the areas, many of them, particularly in the areas of water and food. And with the population growth, we think this is going to be one of the problem areas of the world over the next 20 years. And I think the international community really needs to focus. So one of the trends which we've noticed is the changes in the far-right terrorism, or the increases in it over the last period of time. So this graph goes back to 2002, but if we look in the last 5 years, the number of deaths through far-right terrorism has increased by 250%. So if we look at, there were 81 deaths in 2019 attributed to far-right extremists. So now, if you look at the graph on the left-hand side where it's titled instances, you'll see political up there way above religious, okay? And so this is it. So, and this is looking at what we determine the West, which is pretty much the Western liberal democracies. So that big spike we see in 2017 was actually caused by left-wing radicals, which were related to trying to shut down the transport system during the G20 meetings, which were held in Germany. So just keep that in mind. But we can see, although they didn't result in deaths, there is far left activity as well. Now, what I want you to notice here is just the rapid increase since 2011 in far right incidences. And so what we can see in 2011, Anders Breivik caused his attack in Norway, and that acted as a stimulus for other far-right radicals. And we can see now over the last 4 years, the number of attacks have averaged around 50 per year. So the question is, where does this go from here? Now, again, this just gives you an idea of the number of places around the world which are affected by far-right terrorism. It seems to be mainly a Western democratic phenomena. Now, if we look at the distribution of this in incidences, and this goes from 2002 to 2019, we can find the United States has had the most, Germany second, followed by the United Kingdom, France and Sweden, and then about 10% only come out of other countries. But if we look at the distribution of deaths, we see something quite different. We see that out of the deaths, we find about 40% of them come from 2 countries, which are in that other 10%. That's New Zealand and Norway. And I think we can relate that back to the countries thought they were safe, weren't likely to get terrorist attacks, so they didn't have strong counter-terrorism operations within their countries. Now, one of the interesting things of which we can see from far-right terrorism in Islamic terrorism, they're a lot less likely to be affiliated with an organisation, which means it's much harder to actually track them down. Whereas if we look at separatists, far left or environmentalists, they're much more likely to be associated with a group. If they're associated with a group, counterintelligence or intelligence organisations have the ability to infiltrate, and then they can unknit them from the inside. But it's when it's lone wolves who get radicalised on their own on the internet then cause an attack, it's much, much harder to track them down. So if we look at mass shootings, and like this is related to the US, so a couple of slides now, we can see that the mass shootings for terrorism has been on the rise since about 2012. But we can also see that mass shootings within the US is on the rise as well. So if we go back and we take from 1982, we'll find that 22% of all the mass shootings have actually been an act of terrorism. But we can see that's sort of jumped quite substantially as a percentage in the last few years. So the trend there is rather worrying. Now, this is I think out of all the pieces of information which came out in those research, this was the one which I think struck me the most. So we went back just to November 2017, 2 years ago. What we find is the number of people in America thought that violence can be at least partly justified in a political context was under 10%, about 8%. What was seen over the last 2 years, this is radically increased. So as we're at this stage now, roughly 35% of both Democrats and Republicans feel that political violence can be partially justified, and that is a worrying trend. Hopefully, with new administration, that may start to improve. But I think one of the points I want to really take away, so if we're looking at measures of resilience, and we'd use our measures of positive peace for this, there's a concept called attitudes within that. It's one of the domains. What we can find in the Western democracies, a lot of these attitudes are decreasing or are falling. So group grievances are on the rise. Disinformation is on the rise. The fractionalisation of elites, that's where the elites tend to fight more with each other than work with each other. That you can see epitomised, let's say, by Brexit, or you can see it epitomised by the last US election. Measures of political democracy, measures of freedom and equitable distribution of resources are also declining. So if we come out the back of COVID-19, this is a trend which I think politicians globally need to watch and try and rectify. Stimulating the economy just won't be enough. We have to go back and look at fundamental changes of how the governments interact with their citizens and a lot of the pillars within democracy. If we look back over the last decade, up to 2020, we can see that demonstrations and riots have increased by 240%. And so that's a trend which will, once we come out of the COVID-19 lockdowns, is likely to increase, particularly in an environment which is economically subdued. We're almost at the end of this presentation now. One of the interesting things is with terrorist groups, if we went back to 2002, we took the number which were active then, which was about 105. So we hit 2019, only 20 of them are still active. These terrorist groups break quite quickly, form new groups, and it's the fluidity, as we can see, is what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa is truly amazing. Now, we look at group grievances. That's one of the things which is both common in both the developed economies and the less developed economies. So in the advanced economies, it's slightly statistically significant. In the developing economies, it's highly statistically significant. So that's one of the things which we find in common. Now, one of the things we used a lot of mathematical models to actually, combining it with systems theory, to get a better understanding of what causes terrorist groups to flourish. What we'd say is, it comes back to this concept of influence, and influence can be expressed in many, 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 many different ways. This model applies for areas other than terrorism as well, but influence might be the number of terrorist attacks which they cause. So there's three, this is a very simplistic way of expressing it, but there's three different things which are important. It's the level of media coverage and social media interactions which these groups can have. It's the level of funding, and it's the number of sympathisers which they have, and then their ability to convert those sympathisers into recruits. And so the three play and interact together. One's not causal on the other. All of them are causal on each other in different ways and forms. So any good counter-terrorism strategy really needs to focus on all three things simultaneously to be effective. Now, that, my friends, is the end of my presentation. I'm now really looking forward to hearing President Danielo Turk comment on, from his perspective, on the state of terrorism.